At some point today, or yesterday, or sometime in the past week, you probably felt something that could have made you cry. Maybe it did. Maybe it almost did. Maybe you felt that specific pressure behind the eyes, that tightening in the throat, that sensation of something rising that you either let come or pushed back down. You did not think about this as strange. Crying when you feel something strongly is one of the most ordinary and unremarkable things a human being can do. Children cry, adults cry, people cry at funerals and at weddings and at films and at songs, and sometimes at things they cannot even name, at a quality of light on a particular afternoon, at the smell of something that used to mean something, at a piece of music that arrives in exactly the right moment. It is ordinary. It is universal. Every human culture has it, and it is, as far as we can determine from the scientific evidence, completely unique to our species. Other animals produce tears. The eyes of all mammals are kept moist by a continuous film of liquid that prevents the cornea from drying out. Crocodiles produce tears while eating, which is where the phrase crocodile tears comes from, though the mechanism is physiological rather than emotional. Elephants and other large mammals sometimes have fluid running from their eyes in conditions of distress or injury. But the systematic production of emotional tears, tears triggered by psychological states, rather than physical irritation or corneal maintenance, tears produced in response to grief and loss and joy and beauty, and the particular kind of feeling that has no name, appears to be something that only human beings do. The question of why is one of the most genuinely puzzling questions in evolutionary biology and the science of emotion. Because from a straightforward evolutionary standpoint, emotional crying is extremely difficult to explain. It is metabolically costly. It is visually conspicuous. It signals vulnerability and distress to anyone observing, and it is not obviously connected to any behavior that would directly enhance survival or reproduction. And yet it persisted. It appears to have been with us for a very long time. It is universal across all human populations, and it produces effects, both in the person crying and in the people who witness it, that suggest it is doing something important. Let's begin with what crying actually is at a biological level. The neuroscientist and psychologist Randolph Cornelius at Vassar College has spent several decades studying the science of crying and is one of the leading authorities on what the phenomenon actually involves. Cornelius distinguishes between three types of tear production: basal tears, which are the continuous low-level moisture that keeps the eyes lubricated; reflex tears, which are produced in response to physical irritation such as smoke, dust, or cutting onions; and emotional tears, which are produced in response to psychological states and which are the subject of this video. Emotional tears differ from reflex tears in their composition. The endocrinologist William Frey at the Ramsey Medical Center in Minnesota conducted pioneering research in the 1980s on the biochemical composition of emotional versus reflex tears and found a significant difference. Emotional tears contain higher concentrations of certain proteins and hormones than reflex tears, including prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and leucine-enkephalin, which is a natural painkiller. Frey's finding led him to propose what became known as the biochemical hypothesis of emotional crying, that crying functions as an excretory mechanism, removing stress hormones and other biochemicals from the body in a way that produces the subjective sense of relief that many people report after crying. The biochemical hypothesis has intuitive appeal and has been widely cited in popular discussions of crying. However, it has also been extensively critiqued. The concentrations of stress hormones in tears are too low to account for meaningful reduction in their overall levels in the body. The amounts of hormones excreted in a typical crying episode are, from a physiological standpoint, essentially trivial, and the research on whether crying actually produces the cathartic relief it is supposed to produce has produced mixed results. The psychologist Jonathan Rottenberg at the University of South Florida has conducted what is probably the most systematic research program on the psychology of crying, including large-scale studies in which thousands of participants reported on recent crying episodes and their emotional consequences. Rottenberg's findings are more complicated than the popular narrative about crying suggests. Most people, most of the time, do feel better after crying, but a significant minority feel worse. And the conditions under which crying produces relief versus prolonged distress depend on a complex set of factors, including the social context of the crying, the degree of social support present, and what the person was crying about. Rottenberg's most significant contribution to the science of crying is his emphasis on its social dimension. Crying, Rottenberg argues, is fundamentally a social behavior. It is not primarily a mechanism for excreting stress hormones or producing physiological regulation. It is primarily a signal directed at other people that has social consequences. This is where the evolutionary analysis of crying becomes interesting. The evolutionary psychologist Ad Vingerhoets at Tilburg University in the Netherlands has spent more than 2 decades studying crying from an evolutionary perspective and is the author of the most comprehensive scientific treatment of the subject. His 2013 book, Why Only Humans Weep: Unraveling the Mysteries of Tears. Vingerhoets argues that emotional crying can only be understood as a social signal, specifically as a signal of attachment distress that evolved in the context of the infant-caregiver relationship. The starting point of Vingerhoets' account is the observation that human infants cry. This is not surprising. Many mammalian infants produce distress vocalizations. What is distinctive about human infant crying is that it occurs in association with tears, and that the visual signal of tears, as distinct from the auditory signal of crying vocalizations, has its own powerful effect on caregivers. Vingerhoets proposes that the visual signal of tears evolved because it was highly effective at eliciting caregiving behavior from adults. The sight of tears on a child's face is one of the most powerful triggers of caregiving motivation in human adults. It is almost impossible for most adults to see a child crying tears and not feel an immediate pull toward approaching, comforting, and helping. The tears communicate need, vulnerability, and the non-threatening nature of the communication in a way that is unusually hard to ignore or dismiss. This infant origin of emotional crying, Vingerhoets argues, explains several features of crying that would otherwise be puzzling. It explains why crying is associated with a distinctive facial expression, the so-called sad face, that shares features with infant distress expressions. It explains why crying is associated with a kind of helplessness and vulnerability, rather than with threat or aggression, and it explains why the sight of another person's tears is such a powerful elicitor of prosocial responses in most people. On this account, adult emotional crying is a retained infantile behavior, a behavior that originated in the infant-caregiver attachment system and that persisted into adult life because the social effects it produced remained adaptive. Adults who could cry when in genuine need of social support were more likely to receive that support than adults who could not signal their distress visually. Over evolutionary time, the capacity for adult emotional crying was maintained by selection because it functioned as an honest, hard-to-fake signal of genuine attachment need. The hard-to-fake aspect of this signal is crucial to the evolutionary argument. Evolutionary theory has a well-developed account of why some signals are reliable and others are not. Signals that are cheap to produce can be faked easily and therefore lose their reliability as indicators of genuine states. Signals that are costly to produce, or that are directly connected to the internal state they signal, are much harder to fake and therefore more reliable. Emotional tears appear to satisfy the hard-to-fake criterion in a specific way. The production of emotional tears is not under voluntary control in the way that, say, a verbal statement of distress is. You can say that you are sad when you are not. You cannot, in most cases, produce tears at will to deceive an observer. The involuntary nature of emotional crying is part of what makes it a reliable signal. Like the involuntary blush we examined in a previous video in this series, the involuntary tear is credible precisely because it cannot easily be manufactured for strategic purposes. This does not mean that crying cannot be used strategically. People do sometimes cry in ways that are at least partially motivated by the social effects the crying produces. But the strategic use of crying is possible only because the genuine, involuntary version exists and is reliably associated with genuine distress. The strategic version is parasitic on the genuine version. The social effects of witnessing another person's tears have been documented in a series of experiments by the social psychologist Michael Hasson at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. Hasson and his colleagues presented observers with photographs of faces, some showing tears and some digitally altered to remove the tears, and asked them to rate the emotional states of the faces and to indicate how willing they were to provide support. Faces with tears were rated as significantly sadder, more vulnerable, and more in need of support than the same faces without tears, and observers reported significantly more motivation to approach and help the tearful faces. Hasson's research also found something particularly striking about the social function of tears. When the tears were digitally removed from faces showing expressions of distress, observers became significantly less able to accurately identify the emotional state of the face. The tears, it appears, are not simply additional information layered on top of a facial expression. They are a crucial signal in their own right, one that substantially increases the legibility of emotional states to social observers. This finding connects to a broader point about the relationship between crying and what psychologists call empathy. The capacity for empathy, for perceiving and sharing the emotional states of others, is one of the most distinctive features of human social cognition, and crying appears to be one of the primary mechanisms through which human emotional states are made visible and legible to others in a way that elicits empathic response. The developmental psychologist Michael Trimble at the Institute of Neurology in London has proposed that the capacity for emotional crying is not just related to empathy, but is partially constitutive of it. In his 2012 book, Why Humans Like to Cry, Trimble argues that the experience of being moved to tears, whether by one's own distress, or by witnessing the distress, or the beauty, or the poignancy of something external, involves the same neural systems that underlie empathy and social cognition more broadly. Trimble's most striking observation is about the relationship between crying and what he calls aesthetic emotion, the experience of being moved by music, art, literature, film, or natural beauty. The tears produced by a piece of music that arrives at exactly the right moment, or by a film that captures something true about human experience, or by a view that is almost too beautiful to bear, are, in Trimble's account, a form of empathic response. They represent the perceptual and social systems of the brain being activated by non-social stimuli that resemble, in their structure or their intensity, the kinds of inputs those systems were designed to process. Music, in particular, appears to be an extraordinarily powerful trigger of emotional tears. The musicologist John Sloboda, in a landmark 1991 study, asked participants to identify musical passages that reliably produced physical responses, including tears, and what he called a lump in the throat. He found that the passages identified were consistently associated with structural features of the music that violated the listener's expectations in a specific way. Unexpected harmonies, melodic appoggiaturas, sudden dynamic changes, and other structural surprises that produced what Sloboda called chills, or frisson, in some listeners, and tears in others. This suggests that the response of tears to music involves the same prediction and expectation systems that are implicated in emotional responses more broadly. The brain is continuously modeling what is likely to happen next. When what happens next violates the model in a way that is simultaneously surprising and satisfying, in a way that exceeds expectations rather than failing them, the emotional response can reach the threshold at which tears are produced. The fact that music can make human beings cry is, from an evolutionary standpoint, deeply puzzling. Music is not a biological stimulus that was present in the ancestral environment in any form that would have had adaptive significance. It is a cultural invention, and yet it reliably produces one of the most ancient and most biologically significant human responses. This paradox points toward the conclusion that crying is not a narrowly targeted response to a specific class of stimuli, but a response to a broader class of emotional experiences that can be activated by a wide range of inputs, including inputs that were never present in the environment in which the response evolved. What unites the stimuli that reliably produce emotional tears, from the loss of a loved one to a piece of music that captures something essential to a view that is almost too beautiful to bear, appears to be their capacity to produce an experience of emotional intensity that exceeds the individual's ordinary capacity to contain it. The tears are, in this sense, an overflow. They mark the point at which the emotional system is operating at a level that requires expression, release, and social signaling. The thing you are doing when you cry, in other words, is not simply producing a biological secretion. You are doing something that is simultaneously physiological and social and aesthetic and deeply human, something that connects the infant attachment system with adult social cognition and aesthetic experience in a way that is, as far as we know, without parallel in any other species. The tears that almost came today, or yesterday, or sometime last week, are the endpoint of an evolutionary history that began with an infant signaling need to a caregiver, developed through the maintenance of social bonds in the most complex social species that has ever lived, and arrived at the capacity to be moved, not just by loss and pain, but by music and beauty and the particular quality of a life fully felt. No other animal arrived here. Only you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.